The transition of hundreds of thousands of German prisoners of war from the devastated, blood-soaked battlefields of North Africa and Europe to the pristine, untouched, and overwhelmingly abundant landscape of the United States remains one of the most surreal and psychologically transformative episodes of the Second World War. For the men of the German Wehrmacht and the elite Afrika Korps, capture usually meant the dreaded anticipation of brutal captivity, starvation, and misery, heavily reinforced by the relentless propaganda apparatus of Joseph Goebbels. The Third Reich had systematically indoctrinated its soldiers to believe that the United States was a culturally bankrupt, racially degenerate, and economically hollow nation controlled by corrupt elites, entirely incapable of fighting a sustained global war or managing the vast logistical nightmare of housing enemy combatants. Furthermore, German soldiers were repeatedly told that if they fell into American hands, they would be subjected to severe torture, shipped to frozen wastelands, or summarily executed. However, the reality that awaited these men across the Atlantic Ocean was so diametrically opposed to their expectations that it induced a profound state of cognitive dissonance. From the moment they caught their first glimpse of the American coastline, the German prisoners were confronted with the most unusual, incomprehensible sight of their lives: a nation operating at the absolute peak of its industrial and agricultural capacity, entirely untouched by the ravages of the war that was tearing the rest of the globe apart. This monumental clash between the bleak, apocalyptic expectations of the prisoners and the vibrant, prosperous reality of the American home front served to systematically dismantle the ideological foundations of their loyalty to the Nazi regime, paving the way for a post-war reconciliation that would have been unimaginable on the battlefields of Tunisia or Normandy. The psychological journey of the German prisoner of war began long before they set foot on American soil. It commenced in the suffocating holds of the Liberty ships that transported them across the Atlantic. For many of these men, particularly the veterans of Erwin Rommel's Afrika Korps who surrendered by the tens of thousands in the spring of 1943, the voyage was an experience fraught with profound anxiety. They were acutely aware that the Atlantic Ocean was the hunting ground of their own Kriegsmarine U-boats, and the terrifying irony of being torpedoed and drowned by their own comrades weighed heavily upon their minds. The ships were crowded, the conditions were austere, and the future was a terrifying blank slate. Yet, as the convoys approached the eastern seaboard of the United States, usually navigating toward major ports of entry such as New York, Boston, or Norfolk, the prisoners experienced their first major shock. Having lived for years under the strict, absolute blackout conditions of a Europe terrified by Allied strategic bombing, the German soldiers were utterly astonished to see the American coastline ablaze with electricity. The sight of the New York City skyline, fully illuminated and glittering against the night sky, was a visual impossibility to minds conditioned by total war. There were no searchlights probing the clouds for bombers, no air raid sirens echoing across the water, and no ruined husks of bombed-out buildings lining the shores. The sheer expenditure of energy required to light up a city of that magnitude was a casual display of infrastructural wealth that instantly exposed the lies of the Nazi propaganda ministry. If the United States was truly a failing, besieged nation on the brink of collapse, how could it afford to burn millions of watts of electricity simply to illuminate its streets and skyscrapers? Upon disembarking at the docks, the visual assault of American abundance continued to overwhelm the newly arrived prisoners. The port facilities were teeming with a level of mechanized activity that dwarfed anything the Germans had witnessed in Europe. They saw endless fleets of trucks, massive cranes loading and unloading mountains of cargo, and thousands of well-fed dockworkers moving with a coordinated efficiency that belied the German myth of American laziness. However, the most profound shock awaited them as they were transferred from the docks to the railway stations to begin their journey into the American interior. The prisoners, expecting to be herded into filthy, unventilated wooden boxcars, the standard method of military transport for both troops and prisoners in Europe, were instead directed to board upholstered Pullman passenger cars. For men who had spent the last several years sleeping in muddy trenches, freezing in the deserts of North Africa, and enduring the brutal deprivation of frontline combat, the sight of cushioned seats, clean windows, and functioning climate control was nothing short of miraculous. Many of the prisoners initially believed that this luxurious transportation was a temporary ruse, a piece of theatrical propaganda staged by the Americans for the benefit of the International Red Cross, and that they would soon be transferred to the bleak, punishing conditions they felt they deserved as defeated enemies. As the trains began their long journeys westward and southward toward the vast network of over 500 prisoner-of-war camps established across the country, the sheer geographical scale of the United States became the next crushing realization for the German soldiers. The trains rolled on for days, traversing hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles of varied terrain. The prisoners stared out the windows of their passenger cars, watching the landscape shift from the dense, industrialized urban sprawl of the East Coast to the rolling, fertile farmlands of the Midwest, the vast, arid expanses of the Great Plains, and the deep, sweltering pine forests of the Deep South. They traveled for hours on end without seeing a single bombed-out bridge, a shattered factory, or a ruined city. The land was infinitely vast, incredibly diverse, and universally productive. This continuous, unbroken view of an untouched continent served as a devastating geographical lesson. The core geopolitical philosophy of the Third Reich, the concept of Lebensraum or living space, was predicated on the idea that a nation required territorial expansion and the violent subjugation of its neighbors to secure enough agricultural land to feed its population. Yet, outside the windows of their train cars, the German prisoners saw a single nation that possessed more fertile, productive, and secure living space than the entire continent of Europe. The vastness of the American landscape made the bloody, desperate struggles over tiny strips of European territory seem absurd and ultimately futile. It became painfully, undeniably clear to the prisoners that Germany, a geographically constrained nation with limited resources, could never hope to win a prolonged war of attrition against an adversary of such continental magnitude. The logistical and administrative effort required to manage this massive influx of enemy combatants was overseen by the Office of the Provost Marshal General, and it was executed with a strict, almost meticulous adherence to the terms of the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. The United States government, acutely aware that hundreds of thousands of American servicemen were simultaneously falling into German hands in the European theater, was absolutely determined to provide exemplary treatment to the German prisoners on American soil, hoping that this strict adherence to international law would guarantee reciprocal treatment for American boys held in the stalags of the Reich. This policy of strict fairness translated into living conditions that the German prisoners found highly unusual and almost embarrassingly comfortable. Upon arriving at their designated camps, which were frequently located in remote, rural areas of states like Texas, Oklahoma, Alabama, and Kansas to minimize security risks, the prisoners found well-constructed barracks equipped with electricity, indoor plumbing, hot showers, and comfortable cots with clean linens. The camps were laid out methodically, often featuring designated areas for recreation, sports fields, and space for prisoners to cultivate their own flower and vegetable gardens. While the perimeters were secured with barbed wire fences and guarded by armed American military police, the atmosphere inside the camps was rarely oppressive. However, the single most powerful weapon in the American arsenal of psychological de-escalation was the food. The diet provided to the German prisoners of war was, by the standards of the time, unimaginably lavish. The Geneva Convention stipulated that prisoners of war must receive rations equal in nutritional value and quantity to those provided to the base troops of the detaining power. Consequently, the German soldiers, many of whom had been subsisting on meager, heavily rationed, and nutritionally deficient diets for years, were suddenly thrust into the staggering abundance of the American military supply chain. They were served massive quantities of fresh beef, pork, and poultry, foods that had become rare luxuries in wartime Germany. They received unlimited access to pure white bread, real butter, fresh milk, eggs, seasonal fruits, and vegetables. Perhaps most astonishingly, they were provided with generous rations of real coffee, tobacco, and sugar. The dining halls in the POW camps became the ultimate symbols of American economic invincibility. It was impossible for the Nazi ideology to maintain its grip on the minds of men who were currently sitting in comfortable mess halls, eating better food as defeated prisoners than they had ever eaten as conquering heroes. The abundance of the food served to wash away the bitter resentment of defeat, replacing it with a profound, quiet awe at the logistical miracles capable of being performed by the American agricultural sector. The prisoners recognized that a nation that could afford to feed its captured enemies so extravagantly, while simultaneously supplying a multi-front global war and feeding its own civilian population without severe hardship, was a nation that possessed infinite strength. The establishment of the prisoner of war camps in the United States coincided with a severe, desperate shortage of civilian manpower on the American home front. As millions of young, able-bodied American men were drafted into the armed forces and sent overseas to fight, the agricultural and industrial sectors of the country faced a critical crisis. Crops were rotting in the fields for lack of harvesters, and essential wartime industries were struggling to meet production quotas. To alleviate this crippling labor shortage, the War Department initiated a massive program to utilize the German prisoners of war as an emergency workforce. Under the strict guidelines of the Geneva Convention, prisoners could be compelled to perform non-hazardous labor that was not directly related to the manufacturing of weapons or munitions, and they were required to be paid a fair wage, typically around 80 cents a day in the form of camp canteen scrip. This labor program brought the German prisoners out from behind the barbed wire fences and directly into the heart of American civilian communities, fostering a series of interactions that would further shatter their preconceived notions of the United States. Across the Midwest and the Deep South, tens of thousands of German prisoners were dispatched to work on local farms, orchards, and plantations. They picked cotton in Mississippi, harvested peanuts in Georgia, cut sugarcane in Louisiana, detasseled corn in Iowa, and picked apples in Washington state. They worked in canning factories, lumber mills, and meatpacking plants. For many of the prisoners, who came from farming backgrounds in rural Germany, the agricultural work was familiar, but the scale and the methods were entirely alien. They were astonished by the heavy mechanization of American agriculture. While German farming still relied heavily on horse-drawn plows and manual labor, American farmers utilized fleets of gasoline-powered tractors, mechanical harvesters, and sophisticated irrigation systems. The prisoners worked side by side with American farmers, who, despite initial reservations about working with the enemy, often grew to appreciate the disciplined, hard-working, and respectful nature of the German soldiers. Because the labor camps were frequently located in deeply rural, isolated areas with vast distances separating them from any major cities or coastal ports, the security measures were often surprisingly relaxed. It was not uncommon for a single, unarmed American guard to oversee a work detail of several dozen German prisoners. The Americans quickly realized that the prisoners had absolutely nowhere to run. Escaping into the vast, unfamiliar expanses of the American heartland, without money, identification, or a strong grasp of the English language, was a suicidal prospect. Furthermore, life inside the camps and on the farms was so comfortable and safe compared to the horrors of the Eastern Front that the vast majority of the prisoners had no desire to attempt an escape. This daily, prolonged interaction with the American civilian population provided the German prisoners with a completely unvarnished, authentic view of American society. They saw that the American farmers, despite the hardships of the war, were generally prosperous, independent, and secure. They observed the local towns, where the stores were filled with unrationed consumer goods, clothing, and hardware that had completely disappeared from the shelves of German cities years ago. They noted the freedom with which ordinary Americans spoke their minds, the lack of an oppressive, omnipresent secret police force, and the relaxed, informal nature of American social interactions. The prisoners were often invited to share meals with the farming families they worked for, breaking bread across the table from people who had sons fighting against their comrades in Europe. These quiet moments of shared humanity, exchanging stories and showing photographs of families back home, eroded the dehumanizing propaganda that had fueled the conflict. The German soldiers realized that the Americans were not the corrupted, soulless gangsters portrayed by Goebbels, but ordinary, decent people defending a way of life that was undeniably successful. However, the German prisoners' exposure to American society also brought them face to face with the dark, complex, and deeply hypocritical realities of the Jim Crow South. The vast majority of the prisoner of war camps were located in southern states, where racial segregation was strictly enforced by law and custom. For the German soldiers, who had been steeped in the Nazi ideology of Aryan racial supremacy, the racial dynamics of the United States presented a surreal and deeply disturbing paradox. They witnessed African American citizens, who were ostensibly members of the victorious, democratic nation, being subjected to systemic humiliation, institutionalized discrimination, and daily indignities. But the most jarring realization was the way the racial hierarchy interacted with their own status as enemy combatants. In a bitter irony that highlighted the profound racial fractures of the American home front, the German prisoners, who had fought to destroy the United States, were frequently afforded more respect, better accommodations, and greater social privileges than the African American soldiers who were tasked with guarding them. There are numerous historical accounts of German prisoners traveling on trains through the South, being seated in the comfortable, whites-only dining cars and served hot meals by black porters, while their African American military guards were forced to sit in segregated, inferior cars and eat cold rations. When work details were transported through local towns, German prisoners were allowed to enter whites-only diners and drugstores to purchase sodas and cigarettes, while black American soldiers in full uniform were denied entry at the front door. This bizarre inversion of status, where the white enemy was elevated above the black citizen, was not lost on the German prisoners. For some, it perversely reinforced their own racist indoctrination, seemingly validating the idea that racial segregation was a natural and necessary order. For others, it exposed a glaring hypocrisy at the heart of the American democratic ideal. The sight of a nation fighting a global war against fascism and racial supremacy abroad, while simultaneously enforcing a brutal system of racial apartheid at home, was one of the most unusual and ethically confusing sights the prisoners encountered. This stark reality of American life demonstrated that the United States, while possessing incredible industrial and agricultural might, was still a deeply flawed and conflicted society grappling with its own internal demons. While the external environment of the United States was peaceful and abundant, the internal environment of the prisoner of war camps was often fraught with intense, hidden political conflict. The American military authorities, initially overwhelmed by the sheer volume of incoming prisoners, made the critical mistake of failing to segregate the prisoners based on their ideological convictions. Consequently, regular Wehrmacht conscripts, who harbored little love for the Nazi Party and simply wanted to survive the war, were housed in the exact same barracks as hardened, fanatical members of the Waffen-SS, the Gestapo, and devout Nazi true believers. Because the American camp commanders generally adhered to the Geneva Convention's stipulation that prisoners be allowed to maintain their own internal military discipline and hierarchy, the highest-ranking German officers and non-commissioned officers were left in charge of the daily administration of the camps. This allowed the hardcore Nazi loyalists to rapidly establish a reign of terror within the barbed wire perimeters. Operating in the shadows, these Nazi enforcers established brutal kangaroo courts to punish any prisoner who expressed anti-Nazi sentiments, showed too much willingness to cooperate with the Americans, or voiced the belief that Germany would lose the war. The fanaticism of these groups was terrifying. They believed that even in captivity, they were obligated to fight the war on the ideological front. Prisoners accused of treason or defeatism were subjected to severe beatings, psychological torture, and systematic ostracization. In several documented instances, the intimidation escalated to murder, with anti-Nazi prisoners being beaten to death or forced to hang themselves in the latrines, their deaths subsequently staged to look like suicides to fool the American guards. For the moderate prisoners, the camps became a terrifying microcosm of the totalitarian state they had left behind, a place where reading an American newspaper, speaking favorably of democracy, or refusing to sing Nazi anthems could result in a midnight visit from the camp enforcers. The American authorities were initially naive to the extent of this internal terror network, believing that the prisoners, grateful for the good food and safe conditions, would naturally abandon their radical ideologies. However, as the violence escalated and the bodies began to accumulate, the War Department realized that passive containment was insufficient. In late 1944, the American military instituted a massive, complex intelligence operation designed to identify and segregate the hardcore Nazis from the rest of the prisoner population. Specialized teams of interrogators and intelligence officers began systematically interviewing the prisoners, categorizing them based on their political reliability. The fanatical, unrepentant Nazis, often referred to as the incorrigibles, were rounded up, removed from the general population camps, and transferred to specially designated, maximum security facilities, the most famous of which was Camp Alva in Oklahoma. Once the oppressive influence of the Gestapo enforcers was removed, the atmosphere in the regular camps lightened dramatically. The moderate prisoners, finally free from the fear of violent reprisal, began to openly express their disillusionment with Hitler and the catastrophic war he had brought upon their country. With the ideological grip of the Nazi loyalists broken, the American government launched one of the most ambitious and unprecedented psychological operations of the war, the intellectual diversion program. This top-secret initiative was designed to actively, systematically re-educate the German prisoners of war, aiming to replace their totalitarian indoctrination with an understanding and appreciation of American democratic principles, history, and civic values. The goal was not merely to pacify the prisoners for the duration of the war, but to actively mold them into a cadre of democratically minded individuals who could eventually return to Germany and serve as the foundation for a peaceful, reconstructed, post-war society. The program was executed with subtlety and sophistication. The American authorities understood that overt, heavy-handed propaganda would be rejected by the prisoners, who were highly suspicious of anything that resembled the blatant manipulation of Goebbels' ministry. Instead, the re-education effort relied on exposure, education, and the power of free information. The camps were flooded with reading materials that had been strictly banned in Nazi Germany. Prisoners were given access to works by Thomas Mann, Heinrich Heine, Ernest Hemingway, and John Steinbeck. They were provided with uncensored American newspapers, magazines, and historical texts detailing the founding of the United States, the structure of the Constitution, and the mechanics of a free press. Camp libraries became centers of intense intellectual debate, as men who had been starved of independent thought for over a decade eagerly devoured the newly available information. The program also utilized the powerful medium of cinema. Prisoners were shown Hollywood feature films, documentaries on American geography and industry, and newsreels that provided accurate, unvarnished reporting on the progress of the war, systematically dismantling the false narratives of impending German victory that the prisoners had clung to. Furthermore, the camps established extensive educational programs, allowing prisoners to take courses in English, American history, civics, agriculture, and engineering, often taught by university professors or highly educated fellow prisoners. The turning point in the psychological transformation of the German prisoners occurred in the spring of 1945, as the Allied armies drove deep into the heart of the Third Reich and liberated the Nazi concentration camps at Buchenwald, Dachau, and Bergen-Belsen. The American military authorities, determined to force the German prisoners to confront the ultimate, horrific consequences of the regime they had fought for, mandated that all prisoners be shown the raw, unedited documentary footage of the liberated death camps. The impact of these film screenings was profound and devastating. The prisoners, gathered in mess halls and recreation centers, watched in stunned, absolute silence as the flickering screens displayed mountains of emaciated corpses, the horrors of the gas chambers, and the hollow, haunted eyes of the survivors. For the vast majority of the regular German soldiers, who had been shielded from the true extent of the Holocaust by the regime's secrecy and their own willful ignorance, the footage was a psychological shattering. Strong, battle-hardened men broke down and wept. Others vomited in the aisles or stared at the screens in catatonic shock. Many refused to believe it at first, claiming the footage was an elaborate Hollywood fabrication, but as the evidence mounted, the undeniable truth settled over the camps. The realization of the atrocities committed in the name of Germany destroyed the last remaining vestiges of their national pride and ideological commitment. The unusual, prosperous side of America had shown them the failure of their economic and military philosophy. The horrific sight of the concentration camps showed them the absolute moral bankruptcy of their cause. The cessation of hostilities following the unconditional surrender of Germany in May 1945 brought a sudden, harsh shift in the daily lives of the prisoners. The American public, having just learned the full, horrifying details of the Holocaust and the brutal treatment of American prisoners of war in German stalags, was in no mood to continue coddling enemy combatants. The political pressure to strip the prisoners of their comfortable conditions was immense. The War Department, no longer bound by the fear of German retaliation against American troops, implemented a strict, get tough policy. The lavish food rations were immediately slashed, with meat, butter, and coffee disappearing from the mess halls, replaced by meager portions of cabbage, potatoes, and surplus military hash. The relaxed discipline was tightened, and the labor quotas were increased. The prisoners were made to feel the bitter, punitive reality of their defeat. Yet, surprisingly, the majority of the prisoners accepted this sudden deprivation with stoicism. The educational programs and the exposure to the truth of the concentration camps had instilled a deep sense of collective guilt and resignation. They understood that they were the representatives of a nation that had brought unprecedented suffering upon the world, and they accepted the hardened conditions as a necessary penance. The process of repatriation, which began in late 1945 and continued through 1946, was a prolonged and agonizing ordeal. The United States government, facing a severe logistical backlog and a continuing need for agricultural labor to harvest the final wartime crops, delayed the return of the prisoners for several months. When the men finally boarded the ships for the return voyage across the Atlantic, the mood was vastly different from their arrival. They were no longer the arrogant, propagandized soldiers of the Third Reich, nor were they terrified captives expecting execution. They were profoundly changed men, returning to a homeland that they knew had been reduced to a smoldering, apocalyptic wasteland. The contrast between the prosperous, unscarred nation they were leaving behind and the ruined, divided country they were returning to was a heavy psychological burden. Upon arriving in Europe, many of the prisoners were not immediately released to their families. Instead, under agreements made between the Allied powers, hundreds of thousands of returning German prisoners from the United States were handed over to the British and the French to serve as forced labor in the reconstruction of war-torn Europe, clearing rubble, rebuilding infrastructure, and working in the dangerous coal mines of France and Belgium for several more years. This secondary captivity was a bitter pill to swallow, a stark reminder that the consequences of the war would exact a heavy toll long after the guns had fallen silent. However, the men who had spent their captivity in the United States possessed a distinct advantage over their comrades who had languished in the brutal, starvation-ridden gulags of the Soviet Union. The prisoners returning from America were generally in excellent physical health, having benefited from years of good nutrition and medical care, and they carried with them a profound, transformative exposure to democratic ideals and free market economics. The long-term legacy of the German prisoner of war experience in America is a testament to the powerful, enduring impact of exposure and humane treatment in the aftermath of total war. The hundreds of thousands of men who experienced the unusual sight of a thriving, abundant America returned to Germany as the essential building blocks of the post-war reconstruction. They had seen firsthand that a society could be immensely powerful, technologically advanced, and economically prosperous without resorting to totalitarianism, militarism, or racial subjugation. The lessons they absorbed in the agricultural fields of the Midwest, the libraries of the camp re-education programs, and the quiet conversations with American civilians provided them with a conceptual blueprint for the future of their own country. Many of the former prisoners became fervent advocates for democracy, helping to shape the political and economic landscape of the new Federal Republic of Germany. They integrated the efficiency and mechanization they had witnessed in American agriculture and industry into the rebuilding of the German economy, contributing significantly to the rapid, miraculous recovery known as the Wirtschaftswunder. Furthermore, the personal connections forged during their captivity proved remarkably durable. In the decades following the war, thousands of former German prisoners returned to the United States as tourists or immigrants, seeking out the specific towns, farms, and American families they had worked for during their internment. They brought their wives and children to show them the vast, sprawling landscapes and the local communities where they had been treated not as hated enemies, but as human beings capable of redemption. These reunions, often characterized by deep emotional resonance and lasting friendships, stood in stark contrast to the hatred that had defined the global conflict. The unusual sight that greeted the defeated soldiers at the docks of New York Harbor was not merely an optical illusion or a fleeting display of wealth, it was the beginning of a profound, generational paradigm shift. The overwhelming abundance, the chaotic freedom, and the undeniable success of the American home front broke the ideological chains of a generation of German men, proving definitively that the truth of a free society, when witnessed firsthand, is an infinitely more powerful weapon than the loudest propaganda of a dying dictatorship.